Welcome back, Year 5. In today's math lesson, we're continuing our work on angles, and we'll still be measuring angles with a protractor. Yesterday, we focused on measuring acute angles. Today, we're going to use a protractor to measure obtuse angles accurately. Let's get started with a little warm-up. For your warm-up, you'll be looking at some angles and deciding if they are less than or more than a right angle. Remember, a right angle measures 90 degrees. So on your page, you are going to mark it A down to H, and for each letter, obviously there's an angle that goes with it. So you'll look at the angle and say, okay, is this less than 90 or more than 90? And you'll simply write less, or you'll write more. Remember, if it's less, it's acute. If it's more, it's obtuse. You can pause the screen here because in a few seconds I'm going to pop up the answers. And here are the answers. A is less, so it is an acute angle. B is more, which makes it obtuse. All the angles that are marked less are acute angles. They're less than 90 degrees. The two angles that are marked more are obtuse. They're more than 90 degrees. Now, having this in mind will really help us with this lesson because we're going to be measuring some obtuse angles. And yesterday, as you were using your protractor, you probably noticed that you have two scales on your protractor. So there's always two numbers to choose between. Well, if you know the angle you're measuring is acute, it has to be less than 90. If it's obtuse, it has to be more than 90. So we just warmed up ourselves to be able to identify all the angles as obtuse or acute so we can measure them accurately. Now we're going to move on to the textbook. Remember, you do not have a copy of the textbook, so you have to follow along with me on the screen. Under the Discover, we have an illustration of some students on a playfield. And it seems that maybe they've drawn this hexagon on the concrete and chalk, and they're standing at the corners of this hexagon. Remember, a hexagon is a shape with 6 sides. So now we have Olivia, Ambika, Emma, Mo, Andy, and Ebo. All right, I have a feeling these questions are all going to be about the angles that they are facing each other at. Let's see. 1A. Mo turns from facing Andy to facing Emma. All right, so we see Mo. Right now he's facing Andy, and he's going to turn so that he's facing Emma. Then it asks, what angle does he turn? Well, the angle that he's turning, I can see that 0 line right there, that straight line from Mo to Andy, and he's going to turn towards Emma. So the end line of my angle is going to be the line from Mo to Emma. So in red, now you can see that angle formed. For me to determine that angle, all I have to do is take out my protractor and measure it. So let me do that. All right, so when I line it up, I see that this angle is obtuse. So I know it's going to be more than 90. All right, I put it on my center point, and I can follow that scale from 0. So I'm following it from Andy, and I go around, and I see that it stops at 120 degrees. So the angle he turns is 120 degrees. That makes sense to me because I know when I look at that angle that it is obtuse, so it must be more than 90. Let's try the B question now. It says Emma turns from facing Mo to facing Ambika. What angle does she turn? All right, so let's spot Emma. And she turns from facing Mo. So at first she was facing Mo. So let's draw that line. And then she turns to face Ambika. Okay, so she's going to turn all the way around so that she's facing Ambika. So I'm going to draw a line from Emma to Ambika. So now I can see that angle that she's turned, and it is also an obtuse angle. So I'm going to take out my protractor and line it up. So I can put the center point on there, and I'm going to follow my scale from my 0 line. So I go right round, and when I follow it, I see that Emma has also turned an angle of 120 degrees. This makes sense also because she has turned an obtuse angle, so it must have been more than 90 degrees. All right. So as you can see, measuring obtuse angles is the same idea as measuring an acute angle. The only difference is that it's going to measure more than 90 degrees, so you have to follow the scale a little bit farther. Let's move on to the next question. So for question 1 under the Think Together portion, it says, measure the angle shown with a protractor. So all I have to do is follow the same guidelines we learned yesterday about using a protractor so that I can measure these angles accurately. So I need to make sure my protractor's line is matched up with the line of the angle, so my 0 line is on the line of the angle, and I need to make sure the center point matches up with the point of the angle. Then the other arm is going to point to the measurement of that angle. Alright, so I'm going to follow my scale from the 0 line. And as I follow it going around, I will see that this angle measures 120 degrees. Huh, interesting. So we've got 3 angles now measuring 120 degrees. How do I know it's 120 and not 60? Because the line is also pointing to 60. Well, when I look at that angle, what kind of angle is it? It's obtuse, so it can't be 60. 60 degrees is an acute angle because it's less than 90. So I know it must be 120. Let me try B now. Following the same guidelines, I line it up. This one's a little bit trickier because notice this angle is almost straight. It's not perfectly straight, but it's almost straight, which can sometimes make it a little bit tough to find the center point of the angle. But I'm going to look for it nice and closely, line it up with my 0 line, and I'm going to follow my scale from the 0. As I go around, I see that this angle measures 170 degrees. And that makes sense for a couple reasons. First, it's obviously an obtuse angle, so it must be more than 90. Second, as I said earlier, this angle is almost straight, and 170 is pretty close to a straight angle, which is 180 degrees. Also, since I know I lined my protractor up properly, the only other option for its measurement, according to the scale, is 10 degrees, because the line, the arm of that angle, is pointing to 10 and 170, and I know it can't possibly be 10 degrees because this angle is so obtuse. So it must measure 170 degrees. So there are my answers for number 1. A is 120 degrees and B is 170 degrees. Now for number 2. It says, put these angles in order from smallest to greatest. Alright, well I'm going to try and be clever with this. If I don't have to measure all of them, I'm not going to. In fact, at the bottom of the page, Astrid has said, I can work out which is the smallest angle without measuring. So let me take a look. I can see that number A is clearly a right angle, so it measures 90 degrees. What about the others? C is definitely obtuse, B is definitely obtuse, and D is definitely acute. Well, only one of the angles is acute, so that one must be the smallest, so D is clearly the smallest angle. After that must be A, because A measures exactly 90 degrees. And since C and B are obtuse, they measure more than that. So I can already say D is the smallest and A comes next. So now the only 2 angles I have to measure are C and B. So let me make sure my protractor is lined up properly and I'll get the measurements of these. So for C, I'm going to turn my protractor upside down so that I can measure it properly. If you were doing this yourself, I would just recommend turning your book upside down so that you could measure it holding the protractor the right way up. Alright, so when I follow this from the 0, I can see that this angle measures, it's in between 130 and 140 degrees. And in fact, it's right in the middle, so it measures 135 degrees. Alright, so I'll put that note there. And now let me measure B. For this one, I'm going to have to turn my protractor as well. So I've turned it so it lines up with the bottom line of the angle, and I'm going to follow the scale from 0. And as I go around, I see it's also in between 130 and 140. And when I look closer and count on that scale, I can see it also measures 135 degrees. So that means C and B are the same. Alright, well when something like this happens, you can put them in any order. You could write B and then C, or you can write C and then B, and it doesn't matter because they are the same. If you want, you can even put a little equal sign in between the 2 of them. Alright, let's move on. Now it's time for the challenge. Question 3. It says, Amelia stands in the center facing A. She turns to face C. Alright, in that diagram I can see now that she's facing A, and I have to imagine that she turns to face C. And it asks me, what angle does she turn? I notice underneath that Ash just said, I wonder if I could give 2 answers. Well, I think he could give 2 answers because she could either turn clockwise or she could turn anti-clockwise. I want to go clockwise first. So let's see, if she goes from facing A to facing C, I can lay down my protractor, and as I measure, I can see that she is turned 140 degrees. That makes sense because this is an obtuse angle. Okay, so she could have turned 140 degrees clockwise. But what if she turned the other way? If she passed E, then D, and then got to C? Well, I don't actually have to measure this, and in fact, I can't really use my protractor to measure it because you're going to notice, I'll even show you now, if I try and lay it down flat along the line going to A, the protractor doesn't go around far enough to reach C. That's because this is something called a reflex angle. It goes beyond 180 degrees. So how can I work out what that angle would be? Well, I know that a full turn is how many degrees? 360. And if she turns from A to C 140 degrees, that means the other way is what's left to make 360. So I can simply do 360 degrees, or a full turn, minus 140 degrees, what she would have turned if she went the other way. And I'll find that the other turn would be 220 degrees anti-clockwise. All right, I like that question. It kind of makes you think outside the box. Let's take a look at B. Then Amelia turns from facing C to face F. What angle does she turn, and what do you notice? All right, well, right away I'm seeing that F seems to form a straight line from the center point with A. So if I just keep drawing that line from the center point to A, if I keep it going, it's going to pass through F. So if I lay down my protractor and measure the angle from C to F, I think it's going to be the exact same thing as it was from A to C. Let's double check just to be sure. All right, so I laid it down and I follow my scale, and sure enough, it measures 140 degrees. Why is that? Well, remember yesterday when we talked about lengthening the arms of an angle to make it easier to measure? Well, that's exactly what we've done here. By drawing the line all the way out to F, all we did was lengthen that line. So it's still the same angle that it was from C to A, or A to C. So again, the answer would be 140 degrees. All right, you guys, it's time for your independent work. So here's your independent work. Today it comes from pages 60, 61, and 62. The first page, as always, is pretty straightforward. Everybody should be able to handle that one completely on their own. When you move on to page 2, you'll need to be using your protractor on your own. Specifically for question number 4, it's asking you to measure obtuse angles. I just want to remind you that you'll need to turn your page and turn your protractor so that you get it lined up properly on the 0 line. And make sure the center points match up. I really like today's challenge, question number 5. It's pretty straightforward once you realize what it wants you to do. Just a quick tip. Since it's asking you to measure his turns and he's always going to be standing at X, whatever letters he's turning from and to, you need to connect them to the X. So for example, the first one, he turns from A to F. You need to connect A to the X that he was standing on, and you need to connect F to the X that he was standing on. That forms the angle that he turned. So all you'll have to do once you've drawn those lines is measure the angle that he turned, and then you can fill it in. I want everyone to do the reflection. It's a pretty easy one today, so long as you've been listening. And when you're done, take your pictures and send them to me. All right, Year 5, as always, stay safe and I'll see you soon.